Raise your hand if you're the kind of person who categorizes people when you first see them. Really? A few people? Okay, thought not. Well, if you hesitated, and if you won't admit it, raise your hand if you think we really do need social classification in our societies. Okay. Well, if you hesitated again, I'm assuming that it's both a yes and a no. Are you right? Maybe. Are you wrong? Maybe. Now that I've told you that, let me introduce to you this imaginary woman. What would happen if you could only describe her using one adjective, from which you will be given? You may only raise your hand once. We have 5 boxes here. Raise your hand if you would categorize this woman and put her in the box of female. Okay, raise your hand if you would categorize her as a businesswoman. Raise your hand if you would categorize her as attractive. Raise your hand if you would categorize her as successful. And lastly, raise your hand if you're confused and you have no idea what's going on. Well, you're probably thinking now, what exactly do I mean by these boxes? And more importantly, why? The thing is that we like to put people into these boxes because that's what makes sense to our brains, for some reason. But the boxes that we put them in depends on our influences and our backgrounds, as well as their backgrounds. There's so much proof of this in the science and systems that humankind has spent millennia organizing and categorizing. For example, biological taxonomy has 8 levels that you must filter through in order to properly order a species of life. And this system is so present even in our educational systems and our political systems. Let me give you an example. This is a chart of the government of the United States of America. This is excluding things like the Senate and the House of Representatives, which have hundreds more members. And this is a chart of the government of Illinois, which is one of 50+ states. That makes my head hurt. And that is the reason that when anything becomes too vague for our liking, our brains just shut down and we can't comprehend what's going on. And that's when this happens. And then this. Well, now you're probably wondering, how can we get rid of this classification, since it deeply hinders useful interactions from happening? And can we even get rid of it? Is it even possible? Well, let's admit it. As humankind, we know next to nothing about the universe, so we just love these boxes. We're attracted to them like a moth is to a flame. Also, by the way, there's 160,000 species of moths, and not all of them have been classified yet, so I guess the biologists have something to do. But of course, this system is useful in science, since your chem professor can tell you that the proper name for cinnamaldehyde, which is the chemical that gives cinnamon its scent, is 3-phenylprotuinol. And I don't know what that means, so please don't ask me. But obviously the system is useful since chemists and biologists and physicists and doctors are able to know exactly what is going on when faced with a puzzling situation, which is a really good thing because you don't want to die from a random disease that your doctor's never heard of. But when you think about it, do we really need this in our societies, especially today? If we put that same woman from before down an intricate system where she was filtered from female to businesswoman to attractive to successful and on and on and on, how often, just think to yourself, how often would you interact with this woman? Not often, right? How often would useful conversations happen? The thing is, people are complicated and just like each of us, and we shouldn't and can't filter them. The thing is, categorization is purely instinctual. Henry Tajfel theorized that we don't come up with our own categorization methods, but depend on those that have existed culturally and historically before us. And obviously this was useful since in the time of the hunter-gatherers, we could give plants that we weren't supposed to eat a name, even if it was only a grunt or a hand gesture. And these boxes were the reason that we knew who was to rule and who was to serve. But we don't need this anymore. I used to, and still get very annoyed, when people say that women are nurturers and must stay at home and don't have the same potential as men do. Because what exactly is the difference between the potential of a male or a female? And why are women still labeled as nurturers? Why do people still do it? Is it ignorance? Or is it just so deeply ingrained in our societies that we can't seem to extricate ourselves from it? Now, labeling might have been the only way that we could make sense of the world centuries ago. But do we really need it now? Now, labeling comes from the first things you see about a person before you even interact with them. And these observations and assumptions stay along when we actually start talking to them. Now, let me give you another example. Whenever I get on the elevator in my apartment building, I always get a look. Some of you probably can relate. You know the look that you get when you're slightly different from the norm or just don't fit in. Now, whenever that happens, I always just wait for the person to exit the elevator and turn to my sister, who's quite light-skinned, so she doesn't get the same look. Now, you're probably thinking that I'm the kind of person who gets annoyed at absolutely everything. But what can I say? I'm a teenager, that's what we do. But that goes further when I realize that I've been categorized as an Indian, and therefore an outcast in Japanese society. What those people don't know is that I've been living here for close to 10 years now, and that I can speak Japanese too, to a certain extent. But we say black, white, Indian, Native American, Japanese, but what do we really mean? We haven't progressed that far as a society. And I'm sorry to tell you, but the person sitting next to you is your 32nd cousin. That means no one is purely anything. No one is purely black, no one's purely white, no one's purely Indian, no one's purely Japanese. No one is purely anything. This goes the same for our actions. No one is purely rude, no one's purely kind. No one is purely anything. Now, we see all these fights in politics today, and they start with these boxes and end with these boxes. And from there ensues a long cycle of hate, bigotry, discrimination, and inequality. Now, I'd like to conduct another small thought experiment. As humans on the planet Earth, we are one of millions of species. The sun is 1.3 million times the size of our planet. The Milky Way is 160 million times the size of our solar system. Let those facts sink in. You probably know what I mean now. We're merely a blip in the timeline, and very, very insignificant. And yet we think it valid to assume, categorize, and condemn. It's part of the very fabric that rules our social structures. And I'd like to ask you one question. What did you first think of the people who sat down near you? Just think to yourself. Maybe you thought that you'd never talk to them because they were much older than you. Maybe you thought that you never interact with them at all since they were wearing completely different clothing. Or maybe you thought that they were just different. One of my favorite quotes from the author and educator John Green is when he said, "Imagine others complexly." And I think that's exactly what we have to do now. You're probably thinking, isn't the objective to do the opposite if we're drowning in categories? But no. The thing is that people aren't straightforward, and these boxes try to make them seem straightforward, but they don't work. And these boxes suppose that there can be no in-between and no spectrum and that no one ever changes, which we all know isn't true at all. No, the point is to imagine something outside of those boxes and to stop assuming that people will be in them. If we want the hate to cease, it's about time we start doing that. Thank you.